Welcome to another episode of Further Upstream. I'm Shane Morris. I'm here with my friend and colleague Tim Padgett to talk more about my recent conversation on the podcast. This week it was with Bruce Herman, Chair of Fine Arts at Gordon College. And we talked about the meaning and purpose of beauty, especially as it manifests in art. I'm excited to talk a little bit more about this discussion and maybe question some of the concepts that were brought up in my talk with Bruce Herman. Tim, welcome back.
Thank you very much. It was definitely an enjoyable thing to listen to. I mean, if I heard you correctly, he's had work in the Vatican, which even though you and I are good Reformed guys, that's impressive.
Well, I mean, we can quibble about the role of sacred art and, representations of Jesus and so forth. But I think at the end of the day, Reformed Christians have to sit back and appreciate the fact that, Roman Catholics have us terribly beaten in the world of visual art. I think that, we could step beside the Lutherans and we have some good painters and so forth. There's a lot that they could recommend Protestant art and especially Protestant music and literature. But yeah, when it comes to visual art, sculpture, painting, the Catholics have us beaten. And that's pretty cool that he's got, he's had exhibitions in the Vatican. It shows the caliber of artists that he is considered to be. And I was excited to speak with him. I'd never heard of him, but I began doing some reading about him after a colleague of ours, Brian Brown, recommended I speak with him. And actually, he's good friends with a musician and theologian who I originally wanted to have on the podcast by the name of Jeremy Begbie. And it looks like I'll probably be able to have him on in the near future. No promises, but he's fascinating. And he is apparently good friends with Bruce Herman, and they've done some collaborations together. So I was eager for the conversation, and I appreciated the stretching that happened for me intellectually over the course of that, because I took art lessons when I was, elementary through middle school. And that was one of my favorite things to do on a weekly basis. But my art teacher was this Christian lady. She had some pretty strong views about modern art and some of the diversification, shall we say, that's taken place in the aesthetic realm in the last couple of centuries. And I think she would sit down with Roger Scruton, for example, and have a very cordial conversation. They would agree that Western art has gone to the dogs.
Degraded, yeah.
Yeah, it's degraded. And so I had that sort of, I won't call it a prejudice, but it's a view in the back of my head moving into this conversation. And I will say that Bruce definitely challenged some of that and forced me to back up and at least deepen my thinking or justify my thinking on some things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do tend in a lot of ways more towards the Roger Scruton view of things. That a lot of what we see is in a lot of our artistic culture is a degradation, a devolution. That being said, I think you're absolutely right. When you do have someone who knows their stuff about art, knows their stuff about painting, and can show that you look at modernist art and it can look like nonsense, particularly like postmodernist art, and it's just like what is this? It's a soup can.
Well, that's the point. I mean, nonsense is the point, right?
Right. Yeah, and I think that there is that tension that very often it is nonsense. It is simply trying to say. You look at some modern art, not postmodern art, but modern art, and there's the intentionality to show the rawness, what's the reality behind the beauty, and you go to these, cubism and brutalism and all these kind of things, and it just seems like the goal sometimes is to undo. The goal is to upend for the sake of upending, and there can be, and there's an ugliness there, I think. At the same time, perhaps people like us can get very impatient and like, well, where's the beauty? Why isn't this pretty? And we can be impatient. There is often an intentionality to it. We might not agree with it. And as I think you said in your conversation, that, postmodern art might be ugly, but at least has an aesthetic element that they're trying something, as opposed to some like a modern building, as in capital M modern building, where it's purely form follows function. 5-minute drive from here is the Air Force Academy. And there's two aspects of modernist art going on there. On the one hand, there's the chapel, which you can't see anymore because they got it in a big white box, they're fixing it. On the other hand, there's the buildings. And these things were each made in the 1950s and early 1960s, I think. The chapel is actually remarkable. I mean, it's a clearly modern architecture sort of thing, and it's very stark and these pyramid-looking things. It really does look like
it looks like it might take off.
Exactly. And it is, but at the same time, it's beautiful, it's stark, it's metal and glass or crystal or whatever it is made of. But on the other hand, you look across the quad there, and there's the buildings, the dorms the students are in. And it's purely functional. It also must be horrendous to try and heat during the winter because it's up off the ground. It's up on stilts and stuff like that. And so you do see, I think, in that's actually, I think, a good example of how art can be, the starkness of modernist art can be beautiful, and this is the chapel, but it also can be like, what's the point? Why did you build this? There's no attempt to create anything beautiful in it all.
Yeah, that's an important question for me, and one that I'm surprised it took me as long as it did to begin asking, which is beyond the issue of ugly aesthetics versus beautiful aesthetics. There's an issue of whether anyone is even trying in an aesthetic direction to produce anything other than function. So, the examples, architecture affords probably the most ready examples of this with the postmodern buildings. And John has talked about this before in lectures where he shows, the postmodern buildings, and there are a number of them throughout cities in the West, where there's staircases that go nowhere and pillars that don't support anything and that sort of thing. And the statement is a deeply postmodern one. It's about order, it's about expectations, it's about subverting those prejudices that you have about reality should follow certain rules, which it does, which is why the buildings still have to follow mathematical rules of architecture in order to be safe and up to code, even though they make these aesthetic statements. And that's one point. But yeah, I think it's worth pointing out that at least the postmodern architects and artists are trying to say something aesthetically. They're trying to produce some kind of visual architectural effect. They are thinking on a level that most architecture today does not think on, where it's just pure function, where it doesn't, the typical office building is the perfect example. The typical strip mall is a great example, where it's literally just about function and then kind of catching your attention like a pop-up ad to bring you in. It's all about getting those dollars, getting those bodies in. It has nothing to do with, nobody sets out to produce a beautiful space. I think many suburbs are set up that way. I live in a suburb. I'm not picking on people who live in suburbs, but they're set up in such a way, not only are they trying to subvert or change your views about beauty, they don't care about that. They're just producing something that you can warehouse people in with maximal efficiency, and beauty doesn't even enter into the conversation. This is part of why I wanted to have this discussion with Bruce Herman. This is an important turning point in the series of conversations that we've had planned here on Upstream. It kind of wraps up our search for God's nature in his world. And so we looked at material existence and how God reveals himself through our senses with Joel Clarkson. We looked at how God reveals moral truth in natural law with David Haynes. We looked at how the natural sciences reveal God as creator with Stephen Meyer. And we looked at emotions and mental illness and how our relationship with God and Christ is mediated by our bodies. We don't encounter him as pure spirits. Now I want to really turn the discussion in my last area here to how we encounter and learn of God in his created order, specifically beauty, the concept, the transcendental of beauty. And my conversation with Dr. Herman really focused in on the questions of what is beauty? How do we recognize it? What is its purpose? And then how can we appreciate and produce it? So as you and I talk through here, what exactly beauty means and whether we can define it, I want to direct my listeners' attention to that bigger question of the role beauty plays in meeting God in his creation and in the way he's revealed himself in the created order, outside of the ways we normally look for him as Christians. Because I think no one needs to sit down and say, hey, Christian, you're going to find God in the Bible. We know that. And we're going to have conversations about that coming up on Upstream. But this whole section has really been about, this whole series of interviews has been about encountering God in the created order. And I think beauty is a fitting capstone for that discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that it's very easy for, again, people like us who our life is words, right? Between you and I, we do a lot with words. And then also as Reformed people, we focus on the word. And rightly so. There's a good reason for that. However, we got to remember that with the Bible, fully like a third of the Bible is poetry. And poetry is delightfully redundant. my personal devotion time this morning, I was reading through the last couple of chapters of Jeremiah, and it's all this very poetic stuff. It's not, Mary had a little lamb as fleeces white snow. It doesn't rhyme necessarily. Well, not in an English sense. It rhymes in the Hebrew in a Semitic sense. But there is so much of it is poetry. And when I used to teach Old Testament survey courses, I would often talk about this fact. The reason they do this is because we are persons, and God is a person. And you see that persons don't merely, we don't merely eat, we dine. We don't merely walk, we dance. We don't merely talk, we sing. There's this element to being persons that we relate to things, personally. The reason the beauty is important is because the color blue, my headphones here are blue. You cannot encompass the fullness of blue by listing off the number of its megahertz on the electromagnetic spectrum. That's true, right? It's true. And but it's true that it's thus and such megahertz, but blue encompasses so much more. I think you guys were talking about like a flower. A flower is not fully explained by photosynthesis, and I don't know. Flowers have xylem and phloem. I'm reaching back into high school biology to remember that. But I know, it's just that you cannot fully explain what a flower is by listing off its attributes, and you cannot explain any more than you or I could fully explain our wives by listing off, how tall they are and the color of hair and stuff like that. Those things are true, but we relate to things in personal ways. So beauty is something that matters. But while at the one hand, I was not frustrated is the wrong word. I was really hoping he would come up with a nice definition of beauty for us. But it's almost like that Supreme Court case years ago that's when the issue of pornography came up. And one of the justices, his response was, I can't give you a definition of pornography, but I know it when I see it. And that's a strange parallel, but we all recognize there's something that's beauty. I had to, begrudgingly agree with him that trying to define beauty is maybe not a fool's errand, but close. There is something to that. Yeah.
Yeah. An example that comes to mind, really, the pornography example is really a good one. An example that comes to mind for me, though, is like injury. So if you were to try and define, injuring someone or harming someone, it seems like it would be straightforward. But the problem is a surgeon does a lot of injury to a person. A surgeon does a lot of cutting, a lot of letting of blood, a lot of severing of organs, limbs, things that would be tremendously painful if the patient wasn't anesthetized. And the surgeon is someone who hacks bodies apart. How do you distinguish that from injury? Because the surgeon on a very wooden level is injuring the person, but the intent is radically different from someone who just takes a knife to their neighbor and carves them up. A surgeon is carving up in the service of healing. The surgeon's intent is to actually restore the person or to, excise a cancer or a kidney stone or something like that. It's a completely different thing. But on the surface, if you were just to look at it narrowly, if you were just to take photos of the scalpel slicing through flesh or whatever, you'd think, my goodness, this is an Alfred Hitchcock movie. This is horrifying. And it is horrifying on some level. But there's a difference in intent, a radical difference in intent, such that the patient themselves willingly submits to the process because they know this is for my good. I think something similar could be, and I'm just stepping into the sort of, not devil's advocate, but Bruce Herman advocate here. I think something similar could potentially be said of art, where you look at the point he makes about the crucifix, for instance. Objectively speaking, if a space alien were to enter our atmosphere and come down and land in an art museum, and he walks in and sees crucifixes, the first thing he's going to say is, my goodness, you guys are a bunch of sadistic maniacs because you're displaying these images of someone being nailed to a tree and tortured to death as art. And you just look at them in sort of awe and reverence. Like, what is going on with you? Now, if he's a very clever alien, he's going to figure out there's some other layer to this, right? There's a reason you guys consider this image of torture beautiful. And it's the intent, both of the artist and the one on the cross.
Yeah. No one of us would go to a lynching museum and have the same reaction as to seeing sacred art of crucifixion. But functionally, I mean, actually, if someone were to try to do a lynching picture as though it were a thing of beauty, we would rightly be enraged. But functionally, there's not that much different in terms of like what is being portrayed. It is a horrible injustice, a horrible desecration of a human being, the harm being inflicted. And so there is a subjective element. That's not subjective in the sense of wishy-washy, there's no truth to it, but the context matters. I love the example about medical stuff because like literally antibiotics. I mean, you break the word down, it's poison. Or like we give people who have cancer, we give them radiation, stuff that's awful for you. So yeah, that's an interesting example in there.
Well, the intent is what it really comes down to. And this is why, although I don't necessarily give the quest for a definition of beauty up for lost, I think we probably ought to hold our definitions of beauty loosely, because beauty it's connected to the liminal space between truth and goodness. And those are a bunch of, sort of academic words that I take to mean more or less that beauty must always be joined with goodness and truth. It always has to be connected and intimately serving moral uprightness. And it always has to be connected with and intimately serving the factual truth of the universe, the theories of truth that correspond to what actually is, as Francis Schaeffer would say, and then who God is. So God himself is truth. He's identified with truth, and then goodness in the form of moral love. And then throughout the scriptures, we see God himself is beautiful. He's not just beautiful; he is beauty itself. He is the measure of beauty. So if we're going to try to define beauty, it seems to me that first move beyond saying we're being very cautious is to say God himself is beauty, and whatever conforms to, serves, and honors his nature is going to also be beautiful, which to me means that we can automatically say lies and moral evil are not beautiful. Now, they can co-opt what we would consider outward beauty as a kind of seductive bait or shell, and Bruce even used those words, seduction. Beauty without moral goodness is a seduction. Beauty without truth is a kind of indulgence. So you see the connection that has to happen there between the three of them. But I think we still ought to try to define beauty in some way so that we can say what is and is not beautiful. My concern is that if we say beauty is just an undefinable thing that is in constant relation with truth and goodness, that we run the risk of saying anything can be beautiful, or that anyone can say something's beautiful, that it's subjective, that it's in the eye of the beholder. And I don't think he would agree with that, but I'm not sure how he would say it's not true. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I do think that it is, like we said, it is a very hard thing to define, because the phrase that's been bouncing around my head as you've been talking here is a resonance with the transcendent, which sounds very, yeah. And I think it's because it's not reflection. It's not purely reflection of something else, because a purely descriptive portrayal of nature isn't really art. Nature is beautiful, obviously, but a purely reflective, imitative thing of nature lacks something. So I think Impressionist paintings, 19th century. One of my favorite artists is one of the only Americans and the only woman who is one of the key impressionists, Mary Cassatt, I think is how you say her name. And she does these beautiful paintings, almost always of women women and girls, or women and children. Very feminine in this sense of it's women together, women with their children, all this kind of stuff. It's fuzzy, like any Impressionist painting. Or you think of the other, the French guys, Monet, Manet, all that kind of stuff, and it's fuzzy. But there's something to it. There's something that it catches in the beauty of their paintings that wouldn't be there simply with a high resolution photograph. And we see that they capture something. It's not merely that it's imitating the nature of a pond and lilies and whatnot, or the starry night, but they really do capture something. So that's why I like the word resonance rather than simply reflection. It's connecting to something. I liked your guest's description that it's not merely order when you talk about beauty, because some chaotic things. A storm-tossed sea is beautiful, but it's almost definitionally chaotic. And I think it's like, why is it that, okay, you live down in Florida, you're probably going to have a thunderstorm this afternoon. There's at least a very good chance.
Every single afternoon at this time of year.
Right, yeah. And in Tennessee, we had the same thing. And you see these towering clouds. And what is beautiful about it? Well, part of it's the colors and the light, but also part of it's the awesomeness. And I don't mean my Gen X 1980s, oh, that's totally awesome. But there is that awesome. There's the power that it's pointing to. There's something there that it's saying there's more. When we see a storm-tossed sea, we see the way the waves are dancing and the wind is blowing, and it's pointing to something. Or even if you go in the mountains here, I remember when I was a kid, we used to come out here to ski in Breckenridge, and we'd go above the tree line, and you see these stunted trees, and they're twisted by the wind and the roots and stuff like that. And something about it, even though it's not orderly, is beautiful. And I don't know exactly what I can't pin down exactly what it is, but there's something there. It's got to be that connection to the transcendent. And I think that's why modern art fails so much, is because it's not saying anything. It's just there.
So this gets back to something that Carl Trueman refers to frequently in Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, and that's Philip Reif's book, My Life Among the Death Works. And Trueman makes use of this concept of death works, which encompasses many works of art, to point out the difference between works of beauty that are intended to say something and works of putatively art that are intended to negate something, to tear something down, to deconstruct what came before, the order, the beliefs, the convictions that came before. And so he says we are surrounded by death works now. And a death work can be more than just a work of art. It can be something like abortion. So he would say abortion is a death work, literally. But the concept of a death work is something I would have loved to interact with Bruce further on, whether there are works of purported art that actually function as the opposite of art, as kind of anti-art, as something that is intended to break our touch with the good, the true, and the beautiful, rather than establish it, or to say that there are no such things as the good, the true, and the beautiful, that we're merely sort of subjectively in that space of pure assertion of power. I mean, to get into those postmodern concepts. And there are many examples of this sort of thing that come to mind. We don't have to sit here and rehearse, as Roger Scruton does, all of the most grotesque examples of modern and postmodern art, the statements that are being made there in the most grotesque and sort of sacrilegious ways. But it raises the question for me of where you draw that line, and then how you would objectively measure it. So one question that I would have liked to ask him, I didn't get around to asking him because we just didn't have the time, was I've seen these experiments done. Maybe you've seen these, Tim, where either with a food critic or a wine critic or an artist, a lot of times, there'll be this sort of double-blind prank where they'll bring in works of art that are actually done by toddlers. So they're not really, they have no serious merit. They are, for all intents and purposes, random smatterings of paint. And then they'll bring in these art critics or people who fancy themselves kind of art critics. And this is the sort of thing that can bring down a career. So obviously you got to be sensitive about it, but they will inevitably get footage of somebody waxing eloquent about how this painting is saying something about the struggle of the human condition amidst the chaos and dangers of the universe and the difficulty of living in a patriarchal society and yada, yada, yada. And there's all these, high-minded, very progressive sounding extrapolations that come out of these quote unquote works of art. And then they find out that, oh, this was the work of a toddler. This is the work of an ape. And they're super embarrassed by it. And I don't mean to be disrespectful to anyone, but I wonder deep down, if you were to sort of present that scenario to a lot of art educators and academics in the art world, whether they wouldn't have to admit, yeah, a lot of what we're saying, we're just kind of making up. It's not really there. We're bringing it to the art. And that's my devil's advocate instinct or supposition. What do you think about that?
I mean, yeah, I mean, everyone loved those stories. It's like the ones where they put the guy in the street and ask people questions or people, like, who's the first president of America? Nobody knows what it is. There's a strange joy in seeing
It's
people.
Schadenfreude.
Yeah, exactly. Particularly if it's someone who has a higher status or claims a higher status. There was one situation like that. I think it was like Payless shoe stores, and they took all the shoes and they put it all in like it was some, for
fashion influencers and celebrities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they made fools of themselves. But I mean, I think that with that, while as fun as that is, I think all of us can fall into that in all sorts of ways. You and I would buy a book by N.T. Wright. We buy a book if it has N.T. Wright's name on it, or Roger Scruton or something like that. We would buy it and find it profound. We would be as susceptible as anyone to that. So while it is fun with people who, put on airs, we're all susceptible to it, I think, in many ways. But I think we do see that there is that element in art. There is such a focus on the experience rather than my subjective experience with the art. Herman had said that, part of the role of an artist is to push people's boundaries or push people's expectations of what, beauty can be. I think there's a lot of strength in that because we do need to push beyond parochialism.
Or prettiness.
Yeah, or prettiness or something like that. We do need to be challenged and lots of things like that. My question then is, where's the line? Where's the line between pushing boundaries, challenging people, exhorting people, and simply knocking things over? Some art that we see, it may push boundaries. It may cause people to rethink things. But is it beautiful? I don't know. There has to be a line in there where we're not simply devolving into postmodernism, where nothing is beautiful, nothing is true, and nothing is good. Because his little trinity there, so to speak, of values and virtues, I think are good, and we all recognize them as good. But there has to be a line somewhere. Otherwise, there's two problems with it. One, we end up in a place where we don't recognize beauty at all. I think the other thing is we begin to judge the artistic value of something by whether it upsets people. Just because it upsets someone, it doesn't mean it's good. Some people need to be upset, but that doesn't. Well, okay, we are to a very different sphere in the Twitterverse. Just because we're upsetting the progressive mob, it doesn't mean we're actually saying something worth saying. You and I both interacted with people who seem to their only value, that how they judge whether they've said a true statement about the Bible, is whether or not it upset the right people. Well, that's not necessarily a helpful thing. Transfer that to beauty, questions of art. There has to be a point where you have to question, am I actually pointing to something good, or am I merely pointing away from something? And I think that that's a hard line to judge, but we have to have that question. If it only expanded people's horizons, at one point you're going to go beyond the horizon into something that's not so great.
My highly prejudiced art teacher used to say that a lot of these modern and postmodern artists, are just people who can't draw. They just don't have any skill. And so they just, produce whatever. And I, obviously you be careful with saying something like that because many of them are quite capable of that. But, she kind of lives in my head in a way when I see much that is sort of honored as extremely valuable or extremely profound or meritorious artwork, that it just doesn't look like it took that much effort to me, like a Rothko painting. I have to say, I'm still in the place where I look at that and I don't really think it's art. It's horizontal bars of color gradients. I mean, most people who come in to paint the walls of a house could produce something that is literally indistinguishable from a Rothko. So and maybe that makes me a rube to say that, but I'm not there. I'm not to the point where I could say that those, or the rumpled bed that we referred to. There are a couple of different beds that have been made as art exhibits, and I don't think that that's art. I don't think it's beauty. Maybe I'm insufficiently enlightened.
One thought that I have of that is one of my favorite painters is Norman Rockwell. Classic Americana stuff. You look at a Norman Rockwell painting, and even decades later, we recognize something essentially American in the essence of being American. We recognize something of that. If memory serves, he did not call himself an artist. He called himself an illustrator. I think that's an interesting place to put it because his paintings are very realistic. like hyper detailed in all sorts of ways. They're not impressionistic. They're none of those things. But he really does capture something. And I said, I got to disagree with the guy. I mean, I got to disagree with Rockwell. Like, he really does point to something transcendent. Not transcendent in the sense of the eternity of God, but transcendent about Americanness. He captures something in that. And like, you see those paintings, you see the ones of, the young man coming home from the war, World War II, and you see the smiles on their faces. You see the little girl outside the principal's office with the black eye, and it's great. And it's like a Jane Austen book. I think the reason that Jane Austen stories still work is because you and I can read these stories about middle class English people from 200 years ago, and we're like, yeah, I know that girl. I went to school with that girl. She captured something, and there's nothing flashy about it. But they're able to kind of artists, creators like that are able to capture something. So it's got to be more than merely pushing boundaries, because what they're doing there is saying, this, and somehow they make that connection. I would not want to say that that's not art. Obviously, it's much easier to say that Jane Austen's art, everybody loves that. Numerian Rockwell is a little bit more complicated because it's almost intentionally mundane. But there's something beautiful in the mundane in that.
Well, another pushback I would sort of offer to an academic artist, and I don't know if Bruce Herman would say this, but you guys are very quick and ready to label things that are merely pretty or considered low class or kitschy as non-art or as ugly. For instance, an architecture snob, an architect who's well versed in the greats of the profession would, a Frank Lloyd Wright would look at a McMansion that is produced by a contractor with dormers sticking out everywhere and roofs at different angles and gables of different sizes and shapes that don't match and a weird balcony off to the side. You see these kinds of houses all the time. And they would look at that and say, there's a reason we call it a McMansion, because it is just a dime a dozen sort of raw display of money that has no architectural or aesthetic value. It's just thrown together. There's a whole blog that I don't know if it's still up, but it was hilarious. It was called McMansion Hell. And it was just this architecture major who she went through and just found these pictures. And then she would label them with these funny little labels, the different parts of the house, like anatomy. And it was brilliant. But that there was a disdain for that sort of thing that comes through. You see the same sort of thing with painters who, and I'm willing to bet Bruce would say this about someone like Thomas Kinkade. So Thomas Kinkade is the quintessence of, and I don't want to step on anyone's toes here because I know everyone's mom has a Thomas Kinkade in their house, but the Thomas Kinkade paintings are the quintessence of sentimentality and prettiness over any kind of pursuit of artistic merit or originality or messaging. He's not trying to communicate anything really. And he was widely criticized for that. It was just really, artists unanimously hated Thomas Kinkade's work. That was just, I'm not trying to be nasty. It's just what the fact is. So I think that tells us something. So a lot of artists, academic artists, are really willing to look at the things that common people like. And there's an elitist attitude here. The common people like McMansions and Thomas Kinkade paintings and things like this. We consider them kitschy, right? Michael Bay movies. We consider these kitschy, ugly, and below us. Transformers is not going to win any film festivals or awards at film festivals, but lots of people see it. What does that mean? What does that mean for beauty and art? And what does it tell us about the academic art world's hesitance, especially even among some Christian artists, to say that things most people would look at and say, that's ugly, that's sacrilegious, that's nonsensical, and say, well, agree with them, right? I'm wondering, I know I'm pushing here and I know I'm kind of stepping on some toes, but I'm wondering, to what extent can we say this is like an elitist attitude that has developed? And by the way, I'm not saying this without some academic philosophical grounding, because Roger Scruton made this exact same argument where, and this is, I should point people to his documentary, Why Beauty Matters. Just Google that. Roger Scruton, Why Beauty Matters. He was a philosopher. I think he died in 2017, 2018. Yeah, he was deeply concerned with this issue of beauty and art. And he did this documentary on the decline of Western art and how we go from something like the Pietà and the Sistine Chapel to Piss Christ and rumpled beds and, horizontal bars of color and things like that. And he saw that as a genuine dissent, that it is the sign of a civilization in decay. I think many artists, maybe perhaps my guest from this past week, would take issue with him. But I think they have their work cut out for them as they argue against him.
But yeah, I mean, it does point to the fact that we all recognize, even if we say that the role of the artist is to push the boundaries of beauty, well, we all recognize that, again, that there's a difference between a Michael Bay movie and David Lean. David Lean was a director from back in the 60s and 70s. He did Dr. Zhivago, did Lawrence of Arabia, which Steven Spielberg, and what's the guy who just did Dune, the French-Canadian guy, Villeneuve, whatever. Each of them say that the Lawrence of Arabia was just earth-shattering for them in terms of its beauty. We recognize there's a difference between David Lean's Lawrence of Arabia and Michael Bay's anything, probably, but like Pearl Harbor or something like that.
Hey, The Island wasn't too bad. Come on.
The Island was interesting. That was interesting. It had some thoughts in there. But yeah, we recognize there's a difference there. So it's almost like the postmodernist architect wants to throw the chaos at us. But unlike a postmodern painter, or I guess a painter would be the best way, the postmodern painter can do total chaos and means nothing. An architect or even a sculptor has to pay attention to gravity. So they're trying to say something, but they actually have to obey the rules of nature in order to do so. Again, I do think there's a virtue in a lot of what Herman said about pushing boundaries and challenging, and that beauty it's not a simple question. I liked his analogy about the storms and about the nebulae and all that kind of stuff, because there is something beautiful in the chaos. But chaos isn't beautiful at the same time. So something's more is going on. It's not so simple as that Thomas Kincaid paintings are good because, well, they're kitschy. It's a Hallmark movie. And I enjoy Hallmark movies. They're predictable. I like that about them. But I also know that there's more. There's better. And actually, just last night, I was having a conversation with my wife. She's a bit of an odd bird in the sense that her mother was an artist and her father was like a science teacher, which often happens, the whole opposite attract situation. But we were having this conversation about what is the difference between art and craft. Like art and crafts. Like we hear, arts and crafts. In the sense of someone's creating art and we have these certain ideas about it. Someone's creating crafts and it's usually considered like a crafts fair. It's usually considered less than. Where's the line of distinction there? Because each of them are using media of one kind or another, physical media, paints or sculptures and whatnot. But we know there's a difference between someone gluing, cotton balls onto, tongue depressors and putting them on a poster board. We know it's not exactly art, not exactly. But again, we know that someone could put that together. And again, like the Payless shoe store thing, they could put that and say, someone would find something profound about it. We know there's a difference, but finding the distinction is not easy. It's like we recognize art, we recognize beauty, but figuring out exactly what it is hard.
Perhaps a helpful analogy comes from music. And this is where I'm thinking through it in real time as I try to figure out what the meaning of beauty is and how it must relate to the other transcendentals and how we can say something is beautiful versus something is not beautiful. Music is not nearly so flexible as visual art has come to be. There have been attempts at making sort of tonal, non-melodic music. And typically people just come away thinking, yeah, that sounds like it belongs in a horror movie, because that's the messaging. When you hear that mathematical chaos in auditory form, you think, something is amiss. And that's why we instinctively do that. Part of that's the programming of our Western ears, but I think part of it goes deeper. I do believe, and my wife and I have conversations about this all the time because she's a music major, that music has some pretty strict rules and they're mathematically articulable, as if that's a word, that you can describe them in mathematical terms. And there's a reason why certain frequencies sound good with other frequencies and others do not. There's a reason why a rhythm demands a certain resolution. There's a reason why, you can hear a time signature. There's all these things come from an objective reality that musicians aren't creating. They're not imposing on sound waves or instruments. They're actually obeying and discovering those realities. So what makes a piece by Mozart inherently meritorious, recognizable as excellent, versus something that your kid just bangs out on the piano with no knowledge of how it works? Well, what makes that beautiful is the rules of musical beauty. I believe I'm gesturing toward a conviction that visual art has something similar behind it, that there are rules for the forms and uses of shape and color that visual art has to follow, or it will not be beautiful. But I think we're less comfortable talking about that for some reason than we are with music. Music is a bit more of a strict mistress. She demands that you follow the rules. If you do not, you're not going to be recognized as doing music. And again, people have tried. People have tried to do this sort of, like, who was the famous musician who did this sort of, like, it was just silence. It was like half an hour of silence or something.
John Cage.
I get it's a punchline. It's remembered as a joke because nobody seriously, fine, you made your postmodern statement or whatever, but at the end of the day, no one brings up that on Spotify. Like, no one, and maybe that's a lowbrow sort of thing, but no one goes to a concert to listen to that. I mean, if they do, I'd like to talk with them. And I've got a bridge in the middle of to an island in Indiana to sell them. It's clear to me that music imposes some pretty strict rules. So what about visual art? And is that the case? That's an open question for me. But I mean, we're coming to the end of our time here, but I think it's a fruitful area of reflection.
Well, I'll add a question on top of that. I wonder if there's a connection between that and the reason that the Ten Commandments says make no graven images, but the Bible's full of music. The fact that there's something about the physicality, the visualness of a graven image that is opposed to music, which must obey certain rules. I would have to defer to poets and sculptors and all sorts of people to tease that one out, but there's a thought.
Well, we can bring Lewis into this. He commented on music and its place in portraying beauty. In the Screwtape Letters, there's this chilling letter where Screwtape waxes on about his hatred for music and silence, the two great twin beauties of heaven, and that everything will be filled with either music or silence. And maybe this is a place where the silent symphony or whatever could be considered meritorious. I think you have to supplement it with music, but especially if people are paying to hear you do something. But Screwtape hates those abominable forces of music and silence. He prefers noise, the grand dynamism, the audible expression of all that is exultant, ruthless, and virile. He intends, along with all the demons, to make the whole universe a noise in the end. He wants the melodies and silences of heaven to be shouted down. And that is that audible expression of chaos and ruthlessness is what Lewis associates with the unbeautiful, with the rebel spirits, with the ones who hate God, goodness, beauty, truth, and order. I think there's something to that. And I wonder what visual noise looks like. What is the visual artistic equivalent of noise versus music and silence? Is it possible to make such a thing? I think it is, but I have to confess that at the end of this conversation, having been stretched and challenged in key ways, especially with the role of chaos in beauty, how storm-tossed sea or a supernova can be beautiful, I am struggling to define exactly where that cutoff point is. I think it's there, but I would welcome suggestions for further guests and conversations to sort of help me tease that out. I would have Roger Scruton on, but unfortunately, he is no longer with us. Well, Tim, thanks so much for this conversation. I've enjoyed it. It was more open-ended than we typically like to do, but I didn't want to come into this with easy answers. And I think the result was a very fascinating, open-ended reflection that we can continue in the future. We move into now the next section of this sort of project we're doing on Upstream. And we're going to be talking about something that most podcasts don't cover, and that I've certainly never covered, and that's the goodness of limits, how limits and our creatureliness set us free. So I'm looking forward to that in the next couple of weeks, and looking forward to talking about those books and guests with you.
Sure thing. Thanks. This was an unexpected pleasure. I didn't know if we were going to have much to talk about because neither of us are really artists, but I think it came out quite nicely.